At the heart of Russia's war machine lies a single steel artery. The Ryazan-Moscow pipeline isn't just another piece of infrastructure, it's the lifeblood of an entire army. Stretching across the Russian countryside, this 120-mile line pumps over 1 million barrels of refined fuel every single day, feeding Moscow's gas stations, supplying airfields, and filling the tanks of thousands of armored vehicles. To the Kremlin, it's a $3 billion masterpiece of engineering. To Ukraine, it's a glaring weak point. Because if that artery ever stopped flowing, the consequences wouldn't just ripple through Moscow's streets, they'd paralyze Russia's southern front, grounding jets and silencing tanks in a matter of days. And here's the part nobody in the Kremlin wanted to admit. Pipelines are vulnerable. They can be buried deep, they can be guarded by soldiers, but they can't be everywhere at once. All it takes is a single precision strike in the right spot, and a billion-dollar supply chain collapses like a house of cards. That's exactly the nightmare Igor Sechin, Russia's paying for targets anymore. They were hunting for pressure points. And this pipeline was the perfect bullseye. But finding the target was only the beginning. The real question was, how do you even get close to something Russia guards like its own crown jewels? This strike didn't come out of nowhere. It was the endgame of weeks of methodical preparation. Deep inside Kyiv, Ukraine's military intelligence directorate began tracing the Ryazan-Moscow pipeline the way a hunter studies the tracks of its prey. They weren't doing it blind. High-resolution satellite imagery from American partners gave them an eagle's view of every bend and junction along the line. Day after day, analysts pored over the images, searching for the one stretch of pipeline where Russia's guard slipped, even for a moment. And then they found it. Near the small town of Bozakovo, about 120 miles from the Kremlin itself. On paper, it was just another patch of steel buried beneath Russian soil. But in reality, it was a bottleneck, a section where defenses thinned, where terrain created blind spots, and where a drone could creep in under the radar. By mid-August, the plan was locked. Ukraine wasn't aiming for a symbolic strike or a flashy headline. They wanted a surgical hit on the very artery that kept Moscow's war machine fueled. And timing was everything. The chosen window, 12:30 a.m., when late summer fog would roll in, heavy and thick, dropping visibility to almost nothing. The temperature would hover at 50 degrees, the kind of chill that seeps into bones and makes guards long for their bunk instead of their post. By then, the Russian sentries would be running on their third cup of stale coffee, their minds dulled by fatigue. The stage was set, but knowing where to strike was only half the battle. Because Russia wasn't careless. They wrapped this pipeline in some of the most advanced defenses money could buy, and that's where the real challenge began. On any map, the Ryazan-Moscow pipeline looks like a simple green line, but on a Russian tactical screen, it's surrounded by a spiderweb of red, defenses layered so thick it almost seems untouchable. The crown jewel of this wall is the S-400 Triumph, Russia's pride in the skies. Its massive 92 N6E radar can spot a fighter jet more than 200 miles away, even at 40,000 feet. To Moscow, that radar meant nothing could get close without being seen. Backing it up was the Krasuka 4, an electronic warfare monster capable of drowning entire swaths of sky in blinding static. Anything that relied on radio signals, drones, missiles, even some satellites, risked losing their eyes and ears the moment it crossed that invisible barrier. And then came the Pantsir S-1, the watchdog crouched close to the ground. With twin autocannons and fast-tracking missiles, it was built to swat down anything that slipped through. On paper, the combination was airtight. Radar to detect, jammers to blind, and cannons to kill. But there was a dirty little secret hidden in the laws of physics, one Moscow didn't like to talk about. These billion-dollar systems were designed to look up. Their radars swept the skies for bombers and cruise missiles, not for tiny drones flying barely 100 feet above the ground. At that altitude, the drone wasn't just low. It was invisible, hiding in the clutter of trees, hills, and buildings. The radar's beams skipped over it, the jammers couldn't touch its tethered connection, and by the time the autocannons got a glimpse, it was already too close to stop. That was the flaw Ukraine intended to exploit, not by going head-to-head, but by forcing Russia's shield to look the wrong way at the wrong time. And to pull it off, they would unleash a strategy that looked less like modern warfare and more like a magician's trick. At 11:15 p.m. on August 25th, the first pieces of the chessboard began to move. Under the cover of darkness, Ukrainian operators launched a flock of drones that looked like something built in a garage. They were called Mugen 5s. plywood wings bolted to cheap engines, each worth about $500. They weren't meant to win a dogfight. Their mission was simpler: fly loud, fly dumb, and die spectacularly. 15 of them, roaring toward Russian airspace like a swarm of angry mosquitoes, each one designed to grab attention and force Russia's billion-dollar defenses to wake up swinging. But here's the twist. While those decoys were buzzing toward the border, a second, more dangerous wave was already in the air. Long-range LUT drones, sleek and lethal, streaked toward the Ryazan oil refinery, a target worth billions on its own. For any Russian commander, it was the nightmare scenario. 2 attacks at once. One wave noisy and obvious, the other fast and deadly. Do you pour your missiles into the cheap distractions, or gamble that the refinery strike is the real threat? From Kiev's perspective, it was a win either way. If the refinery was hit, it would cripple fuel production. If the defenses swallowed the bait, the pipeline corridor would be left wide open. And if both worked, Moscow's fuel network would be set on fire from 2 sides at once. The Russians reacted exactly as predicted. Radar screens lit up, alarms blared, and the Krasuka 4 electronic warfare system blasted out its jamming wall. The decoys began dropping from the sky, their control links severed in seconds. Panzer cannons tore through the survivors, filling the night with fiery wreckage. Meanwhile, S-400 launchers unleashed missile salvos, ripping the incoming refinery strike to pieces. On the tactical display, it looked like a clean sweep. Every enemy target destroyed, every threat neutralized. But inside the Russian bunker, one commander wasn't celebrating. He stared at the screen, uneasy. Something about it felt too loud, too obvious. This wasn't an attack, it was a performance, a trick, and he was right. Because while the Kremlin's billion-dollar shield was busy swatting at decoys and fireballs, the real hunters were already inside Russia, waiting to make their move. While radar operators cheered their clean sweep, another drama was unfolding hundreds of miles away. A single truck rumbled along a quiet Russian highway. To anyone passing by, it was just another cargo hauler, mud-splattered, slow, unremarkable. But beneath its tarp wasn't grain, steel, or fuel. It carried something far more dangerous, the real strike package. Inside its frame, Ukrainian engineers had hidden a long-range drone, folded and secured, its wings compacted like a bird at rest. The plan was simple: sneak it in under Russia's nose, then let it take flight from inside their own territory. It was the oldest trick in the book, Trojan horse warfare in the age of satellites. And it worked because Russia wasn't looking for trucks. They were looking at the sky. As the convoy of decoys burned in the night, this lone vehicle rolled quietly toward its launch point. No alarms, no radar lock, no interceptors. Just the hum of tires on asphalt and the occasional flash of headlights. Every mile forward meant Russia's defenses were pointed the wrong way. Hours later, just before dawn, the truck reached a desolate clearing near the Oka River. The driver killed the engine. The silence was heavy. Then the tarp peeled back, the hidden drone unfolded, and with a sputter of its engine, it lifted into the gray sky. This wasn't a $500 decoy. This was the real hunter. Its target, the Poverino pipeline hub, the beating heart of fuel supply to Western Russia. If it burned, trains would stop, planes would sit idle, and entire armored units could grind to a halt. As it climbed higher, its signal stayed quiet. No radio chatter, no GPS link that could be jammed. It flew blind, guided by pre-programmed coordinates, like a silent bullet slipping through the cracks of Russia's billion-dollar wall. By the time Russian operators realized their radars were clear, but the threat wasn't over, it was already too late. Something had bypassed their fortress entirely and was now deep in their backyard. Dawn was just breaking over the fields of western Russia when the silence shattered. Locals near the town of Poverino heard a low, unfamiliar hum overhead. It wasn't a jet. It wasn't a helicopter. It was something stranger, something they couldn't place. And seconds later, the ground trembled. The Ukrainian drone dove straight into the Poverino pipeline hub, a sprawling web of tanks, pumps, and transfer lines that fed thousands of kilometers of Russia's fuel network. The explosion was brutal. Fire shot skyward like a pillar, black smoke curling into the morning air, visible for miles. The shockwave rattled windows, sent workers scrambling, and set off alarms across the entire district. For the Russian military, this wasn't just an attack. It was a humiliation. Billions of rubles had been poured into fortress-like defenses, yet a single drone, smuggled in by truck, had slipped through and gutted one of their most critical fuel arteries. Within minutes, emergency crews swarmed the site, hoses blasting, trucks roaring in. But the blaze wasn't an easy one. Fuel fires are monsters. They don't just burn, they roar, feeding on pressure lines and ruptured valves. Hours passed, and the flames refused to die, and with every minute the fire raged, the consequences rippled outward. Trains carrying fuel to the Western Front stalled. Gasoline deliveries froze. Even air bases began reporting shortages. What looked like a single explosion was quickly spiraling into a supply crisis. In Moscow, the news was downplayed. Officials spoke of minor damage, quick repairs, and business as usual. But satellite images told another story, a black scar cutting across the heart of Russia's fuel lifeline. And in Kyiv, commanders quietly celebrated. The decoys had done their job. The billion-dollar defenses had been blinded, and the real strike had landed exactly where it was meant to, inside the enemy's armor, where it hurt the most. But this wasn't just about fuel. It was about something bigger. Because for the first time, Russia's people woke up to plumes of smoke on their own horizon, proof that the war they thought was distant had slipped across the border. And the question on everyone's mind was simple. If Ukraine could do this once, what was stopping them from doing it again? The smoke over Poverino hadn't even cleared before the real battles began, not on the ground, but in Moscow's corridors of power. On state TV, anchors repeated the same script. The fire is contained. Repairs are underway. No serious damage. But Russians living near the site knew better. Their phones buzzed with shaky videos. Towers of fire clawing into the sky. Entire tanks engulfed. Sirens screaming nonstop. The Kremlin's version of the truth was already unraveling. Inside the Ministry of Defense, the mood was darker. The attack raised a terrifying question. How had a drone made it hundreds of kilometers inside Russia without being detected? Billions had been poured into radar, anti-aircraft systems, and electronic warfare shields. Yet a disguised truck and a silent drone had done what NATO jets hadn't even dared. Blame started flying. Some generals accused local commanders of being asleep at the wheel. Others whispered about corruption, pointing out that contracts for modernized defenses often disappeared into luxury villas and offshore accounts. Even the FSB, Russia's internal security service, stepped in, hunting for suspected inside help or sabotage. But the paranoia didn't stop at the military. Ordinary Russians began to wonder, if a refinery could go up in flames, what about the power plants, the rail yards, even Moscow itself? Suddenly, the idea of the war being far away collapsed. The battlefield had moved to their doorstep. Ukraine, of course, stayed quiet. No official statements, no victory speeches, just silence. And that silence made the strike even louder. The message was clear. If you can't stop one drone, how will you stop the next 10? For Putin, the timing couldn't have been worse. Sanctions were already biting, the economy was grinding, and soldiers at the front complained about empty fuel trucks. Now, as black smoke curled above Poverino, he faced a new kind of war. One fought not with tanks and trenches, but with fear, doubt, and humiliation. And deep down, everyone in Moscow knew this wasn't the last time. History books may one day look back at this night not just as a tactical strike, but as a turning point in modern war. For decades, wars were measured in divisions, air squadrons, and naval fleets. Whoever had the biggest guns, the longest range missiles, the most tanks, won. But Ukraine flipped the script. They showed that you don't need a billion-dollar bomber to cripple your enemy. Sometimes all it takes is plywood, a laptop, and a drone with a warhead the size of a soda can. It was a brutal reminder of a new equation. Cheap plus smart, greater than expensive plus slow. The $12,000 price tag of Ukraine's strike was laughable compared to the billions Russia had spent on its defenses. And yet the results spoke louder than any speech. One drone slipped through, and a $3 billion pipeline turned into a river of fire. For military planners around the world, the lesson is chilling. No fortress is impregnable, no shield perfect. In the age of drones, AI, and asymmetric warfare, the smallest actors can punch holes in the mightiest empires. But there's another lesson too, one of psychology. The explosion in Poverino wasn't just steel torn apart, it was certainty torn apart. Russians who once believed their homeland was untouchable now saw fire on the horizon. Soldiers who relied on endless fuel supplies now watched their tanks run dry. Leaders who promised strength were now scrambling for excuses. And that's the real weapon: fear. Ukraine didn't just strike a pipeline, they struck confidence, morale, and the illusion of control. So, what will historians call it? Pipeline panic? The Moscow gas crisis? Maybe. But in truth, it's bigger than a single name. It's the story of how the 21st century battlefield changed forever on one foggy night, with one drone, and one very bad morning for Moscow. By dawn, Moscow was still burning, not from flames, but from fury. The Kremlin had just witnessed the unthinkable, a pipeline worth billions erased by a drone the size of a bicycle. Official news channels tried to spin it, calling the blast a minor disruption quickly contained. But no amount of propaganda could hide the truth. Across Moscow, gas stations hung signs that read "no fuel." Inside the Kremlin, Igor Sechin sat pale and silent. The oil king, who once strutted with untouchable power, now faced Putin's legendary rage. The pipeline wasn't just a financial artery, it was a military lifeline. And losing it made Sechin look careless, weak, even expendable. In Russia, that can be more dangerous than any enemy missile. Putin's response was as fast as it was furious. Within 48 hours, a barrage of Kaliber cruise missiles streaked across the night sky, slamming into Ukrainian cities. Kiev, Kharkiv, Odessa all felt the wrath. Apartment blocks shuddered, power plants flickered out. Civilians huddled in basements as the Kremlin tried to remind the world of its reach. But here's the brutal irony. Ukraine had spent roughly $12,000 on the entire pipeline operation. Russia's retaliation: analysts estimated it cost well over $150 million in missiles, logistics, and air defense maneuvers. For every dollar Ukraine spent, Russia was forced to burn through thousands. That's not just revenge, it's economic bleeding. Meanwhile, Western intelligence was watching with laser focus. NATO generals pored over satellite footage, shaking their heads in disbelief. If Ukraine could dismantle Russia's war machine with 2 drones and a bakery truck, what did that mean for global security? What about oil pipelines in the Middle East, power grids in Europe? Even America's own infrastructure suddenly looked vulnerable. Energy markets panicked. Crude oil prices spiked overnight. European traders whispered about a pipeline black swan. And in Kyiv, ordinary Ukrainians quietly celebrated, knowing their David had just landed a stone squarely on Goliath's forehead. But beneath the celebration, one shadow loomed. Retaliation wasn't over. This wasn't just a pipeline war anymore. This was a psychological war. And humiliation is the most dangerous fuel the Kremlin can burn. The only question now was simple and terrifying. How far would Russia go to erase the stain of this defeat? The night Ukraine's drone slammed into that pipeline didn't just cripple Moscow's fuel supply, it cracked open the future of warfare. A $12,000 operation had humiliated a trillion-dollar military machine. And for the first time, the world saw Russia bleed in a way it couldn't simply cover with propaganda. But here's the part no one can predict. What comes next? Because humiliation is radioactive. It spreads fast, and it poisons everything it touches. Putin can't afford to look weak. Ukraine can't afford to stop striking. And the West? They're watching, calculating, and quietly wondering if the battlefield has just been rewritten forever. So now the question isn't if Russia retaliates harder, it's how far they'll go when they do. Will this spiral drag both nations into a war without limits? Will Europe pay the price when energy supplies run dry? Or has Ukraine just written the first chapter of a playbook that smaller nations everywhere will copy? One pipeline, one